Hello, my name is Leilani Maldonado, and for my food as art project, I decided to cook tostadas de picadillo de puerco. I started the cooking process by adding water to a pot along with salt and 2 teeth of garlic, and then I added 3 pounds of pig's leg. I checked the meat every 30 minutes, and while that was cooking, I decided to work on my beans. So I poured 1 cup of beans into a pan, and I also started cutting the onions so that it could go along with the beans while they're cooking. Prior to when I started the cooking process, I called my grandmother and asked her for a picadillo recipe because I wanted to cook something that I remember from my childhood and something that has been a part of my family for a while. So this whole process just brought back a lot of memories and nostalgia from my childhood. While my beans and pork were cooking, I decided to start cutting up the vegetables. And at this point of the process, this is when I started to notice the different colors that are being incorporated into the dish. So here I am cutting up the tomatoes into very fine slices so that I could add it to the pork. During this cutting, I made sure that I didn't cut any large pieces or chunks so that they just had to be really small so that they could blend in with the meat well. Though for the potatoes, I cut the chunks into bigger pieces, not too big, but not as small as the tomatoes and the onions. This was actually the first dish I've ever done by myself fully. I had to call my grandma a bit though to help me with the recipe, but other than that, this was my first actual dinner that I made. I ended up cutting up 6 potatoes, and at the end, I had all of my vegetables ready and cut up, the onions in a separate bowl, the tomatoes, and the potatoes. Once the vegetables were squared away, I used tongs to pick up the cooked meat from the pot to put them to another pot so I can begin the shredding. At first, I waited 5 minutes for the meat to cool down so that I can use my hands to shred it, but I ended up turning to forks to help me shred. I then added oil to another pot so I can begin cooking the onions and the tomatoes. I poured them in and I stirred them occasionally until they came to a sizzle. Now, focusing on the beans, again, I poured more oil into another pan and poured in the beans from the other pots and started smushing them so that they can be mushed. And these are the beans done. I then started to pour the meat into the pot with the tomatoes and the onions. Once they were all poured, I started stirring the pork and the onions and tomatoes together. Occasionally, if I saw chunks, I would use my hands to shred it so that all of the meat was properly shredded. I then used the broth from the pot that we previously used to cook the meat and poured it into the new pot so that the meat and the vegetables could soak. And for the tostadas, I added oil and flipped them every so often. And then for the final thing, I added in the oregano, and the finished product looked absolutely beautiful with all the colors and the aromas. It was really just, could not be happier with the outcome. I then began to plate it, adding my beans to the tostada and adding the potatoes and the meat, and then adding the lettuce and the onions along with the tomato and pouring cheese over it. And this was the finished product. I was so proud of myself for how this came out. Using my grandma's recipe really brought me back to when I was a child and when I was with her all the time and how she would make this for me all the time. And seeing how I could incorporate my own little designs into the finished product and how I can make it beautiful to serve to people made it even better and fun, and this will not be the last time I cook this dish. Thank you for watching.